Diep noticed the garden tools first. They had been hanging in the same spot on the shed wall for 11 months. She walked past them every single day. Never moved them, never said anything about them. Just kept the bird feeder full, kept the rose bush alive, held the shape of the garden exactly as he had left it.
Look at them work.
Then one Saturday morning in April, she came downstairs and James was already
You're
outside,
leaving, aren't you?
standing in the old green jacket, hands in his pockets, looking at the empty patch of soil along the back fence.
You coming in, James?
She stood at the kitchen window and poured 2 cups of coffee. Now, Diep is not a gardener. She will tell you that herself. The basil 2 summers ago did not survive past July. The herbs last spring lasted slightly longer.
Clearly, I am no gardener.
The rose bush
Let me show
Nee
you.
insisted
Here, try
on
this.
survives largely
Look at
through
this
its own
one.
Look at
stubbornness.
this one. It's supposed to be basil, right?
But James has always loved
Maybe
this
try that
garden. In the
healthier one
early
over there?
years, before everything
Okay, let me
changed,
see.
he would spend
This
whole
basil
Saturday
just won't
mornings
make
out
it.
here. Just him,
It's okay.
quietly
Try again with
working,
something
turning
else.
soil,
Look around at
pulling
all this
weeds,
beauty.
doing the slow, deliberate things that gardens require. Diep used to bring him 2 coffees and leave him to it. Then came the diagnosis. Then the hard months. The mornings he did not come downstairs until noon. The weeks he sat in his chair and looked at the window
Thank you to Diep.
and did not go through it.
Perfect.
You're welcome,
The day she got
James.
the hose out herself and watered the
Look how
cracked
rich
soil
the soil
along the
is
back
here.
fence, without saying anything to anyone
James, are you
about
alright?
why.
Looks so pale.
She kept everything exactly as he had left it. She carried both cups outside. James heard the back door and turned. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She handed him his cup, stood beside him and looked at the same patch of soil.
Thank you.
"Thinking about
Focus,
putting
stick
something
to it.
in here," he said.
It always is this
Tomatoes,
time of
maybe.
year.
"The old-fashioned kind.
Here,
My.
James.
My father grew them every summer. He had this whole system. The spacing, the watering
I found the
schedule,
perfect
when
empty
to
spot for
stake
the
and
new
how
crops.
high.
Are the conditions right
He
for it?
stopped.
Yes, everything
hands
is aligned
tightened
for a
slightly
successful
around the
season right
mug.
here.
That's wonderful news.
Diep
You
looked at the
space
soil.
plants like this
"Let's
for
grow
maximum
tomatoes,"
sun.
she said.
I see.
Exactly.
"You
so they all
don't
thrive.
have to.
That makes so
I
much
want
sense.
to."
You don't have
She
to
meant
do
it
this
completely.
alone.
"Show me
help
what
you.
to do."
Thank you.
Nee came downstairs at breakfast and read the room immediately.
You shouldn't blame
"What's
yourself,
happening?"
James.
I know.
"We're planting a garden today," Diep told her.
And he is
Nee
here
sat
now.
down,
It will be
looked at her
okay.
parents, looked at Button. Some silent
Maybe he just wants a
consultation
hug,
occurred.
Nahi.
"Can I plant
Be
something?
careful, it looks very
My own
important.
thing." "What do you want?" James asked. Long pause.
Wow, is
"Sunflowers.
That mine?
It
Yellow
is.
ones.
What do you
The
think,
really
Button?
big kind." "Done,"
We're
James
so
said.
glad you're here. Look what
Nee
we
poured her
got.
juice with the air of
Wow,
someone whose
that's
morning had
lucky.
just become significantly more interesting.
Look,
They went to the
James.
garden center.
Isn't he
All 3 of
wonderful?
them. James in the
Wants to
vegetable
say
section,
hello.
reading seed packets with the focused expression of a man who has an opinion about heirloom
I see
varieties
bright yellow
and
flowers
intends
here.
to stand by it.
Yes, that's beautiful.
Nee in the
Good
flower
job,
section,
Nahi.
holding up 2 seed packets side by side, comparing the photographs with
Yes,
complete
you did.
seriousness. Button tucked under
Look
her
at
arm.
these. I think these
Diep
have
found the
right
herb
ones.
section on her own.
Oh.
She stood in front of the small pots on the shelf,
Look at that big
picked
one
up the
over
basil,
there. Look,
put it
this
back,
one has the red
picked it
flower.
up again.
It's perfect.
She thought about the one that did not make it past July. She put the
I think
basil in
this
the
one
basket.
will grow best here.
At the car,
We'll see,
James saw it.
Mimi. Take your time.
"Basil," he said. "I know the last
I'm
one
not
didn't
sure
make
if
it
this is
past
the right
July."
place for it.
She loaded the bags without looking up. "But I
Maybe
found a
if it
spot
had
on the
more
back
light,
step that gets the exact
the
right
mountain
patch of
air.
morning sun."
It changes
trying again.
everything.
It's
He
what
put the
brought you
basil
back.
carefully in the back seat, said nothing else.
I don't know if this
Back
is the
home,
right one.
James took the garden tools down from the shed wall.
I think it'll be perfect.
They were dusty. The trowel had a thin layer of rust along the blade where moisture had
lovely
gotten
basil
in
plant
over
you
the
did for
winter.
journey.
Yes. It's
He
a
sat on the
family
back
heirloom.
step
I
and
want
worked
to
at
bring
it with a
us.
cloth, scraping, patient. Tu Diep sat down beside him without
Careful with
being
those.
asked. After a
not heavy.
moment, he held the trowel up, examined the blade, worked
you,
at one
James.
more spot. Takes a minute to get the rust out, he said. He
at
went
this
back to
old
scraping. Tu Diep watched his hands.
Perfect.
Take your time.
Do you think
She
it will
said.
still work?
They spent the whole morning in the garden. James showed Tu Diep the
You
depth,
make that look
the spacing,
effortless.
why the roots
It
needed
takes some
room.
practice.
His
I can
movements
tell.
were deliberate,
Look how clean it is
careful,
now. Just one last rub.
measured.
Oh, James, it's perfect.
one
Now
point,
we
he
can start
paused.
planting.
Yes,
And pressed
look
a
at the
hand
terraces.
briefly to the small of his
beautiful here.
back, then kept going. Tu
I
Diep
feel
reached
good out
toward
here.
the heavy bag of
I
soil,
know.
amendment,
It's beautiful.
then stopped.
I think
Let him reach
if
for
we
it.
put bright
He
yellow
picked it up,
flowers right here,
set it
it
where
would
he
be
needed it,
perfect.
kept
Yes.
working.
That sounds wonderful.
Nee planted her
I think if we
sunflower
plant
seeds
the
in a
bright
careful
yellow
row along the
flowers here,
fence.
It would be perfect.
James
Yes,
crouched beside
that is a
her,
wonderful
walking her
idea. It
through
would be
each step.
beautiful.
Like
Tu
this.
Diep planted her
Depth
basil in its
and
pot
space.
and set it in the
yes,
ground.
I see.
Exact patch
Perfect.
of morning
Now you
sun
try.
she had already
Okay, here
identified.
goes.
Then she knelt back down in the soil beside James and kept
Oh.
working, her hands
You
in the
alright?
earth.
Yes,
Her
I'm fine.
knees
Just a
dirty.
little stiff. Don't worry, I can keep
3
working.
weeks later, the tomato seedlings were reaching upward with clear intention. James called Tu Diep out before he called Nee. They crouched side by side,
Line
looking
them
at the
up
same
neatly,
small
just
green
like that.
things pushing toward the light. They're going to be good, James said.
Like this?
Perfect.
Tu Diep looked
Now
at
we
the
cover them.
seedlings,
The soil
then at her
feels so
husband kneeling in
fertile
the
this
soil.
morning.
Yes, she
The sun
said.
is perfect.
They are. The basil
I
on
think
the
we'll
back
have a
step
good
was doing
harvest.
well. Better than she expected. She had moved it twice to find the right sun. She had looked up the watering schedule instead of
Come
guessing.
join me. Look at this.
She checked the
Oh,
soil before
They're
watering
so small.
every
How did
morning
you do this?
without fail.
Just a little care.
One
the
afternoon,
tomatoes
James
soon.
came to the back door. The basil is
How's
looking
Mom
good,
going?
he said.
Look how well they are growing.
Tu Diep was already outside,
really are,
sitting
just
beside
like
it with her
us.
coffee.
Look at them. They're beautiful.
I had to move it twice, she said, and I almost overwatered it in the
Yeah.
first week.
You did a wonderful job,
She looked at the
James.
leaves, said nothing
You are
else.
going to love this
James
spot.
came and sat beside her on the step.
Yeah.
They sat there together for a while, without talking.
It certainly looks perfect here.
5 weeks after planting,
Soil
the first
feels
small
just right.
green tomatoes appeared. James found them on a Tuesday
It's like you
morning.
have a perfect touch.
Tu Diep was already in the
Coffee's
garden with her
perfect this
coffee
morning.
and came over. Nee arrived last,
So is
school
the
bag
basil.
over one
Look how
shoulder,
healthy it is.
still finishing her toast. The 3 of them crouched around the plant. They're so small, Nee said. They'll get bigger. How long? James was gently, tying a fragile stem to its stake as he answered. Fingers careful,
Good morning,
taking his
sweetie.
time.
Look who's here,
Few more
James.
weeks,
Hi,
he said.
Mama. Hi, James.
You have to be patient with them. Nee watched his
You
hands
see
work.
these tiny ones, Nihi?
You're really good at that,
Yes,
she said.
they're so small.
James kept his eyes on the
They
stem.
grow bigger like these.
Getting better, he said.
You see?
Nee nodded,
Slow and
picked up her
careful.
bag,
Wow.
went to catch the school bus.
Can I try?
Tu Diep stayed
Look at
crouched
this
beside
incredible
James after
plant,
she
Nihi.
left.
Oh,
The garden was
James,
quiet,
it's so
except for the birds.
beautiful.
The sunflowers
Wow, it's
bloomed on a
magical.
Thursday morning in late June.
Nee.
Nee found them when she came downstairs for breakfast.
She'll be alright.
She walked toward the kitchen
I
and
know.
stopped at the back window
miss
without
her.
warning. Standing there without saying anything for a long
Shouldn't
moment,
worry so much.
just looking out at the garden
I
with
know,
both hands
but
on
it's
the
hard
glass.
not to.
Good morning,
Mom.
Nee.
Tu Diep came to look. 3 sunflowers along the back fence, tall and wide and completely,
Look at the
perfectly
big
yellow,
yellow
facing the
flowers.
morning sun the way they had been
Yes,
tilting
they
toward
are
it a little
so
more each day for
beautiful.
weeks.
They are, aren't they?
Except now they had
Look
arrived,
at them. Aren't they
fully
magnificent?
and
They are
completely,
perfect.
and without
So
any fuss
pretty.
about it,
And the elders
Taller
taking
than Nee,
such good care of
considerably.
Look how big
We grew
they
those,
are.
Nee said,
They're
very quietly,
beautiful.
like she needed to say it out
Remember
loud
when
to
you
be
were
sure
that
it was
age?
true. You grew
All right, go
those,
get dressed.
Tu Diep said. We grew those. The tone that meant this point was
Yes,
settled.
Mama. I'll be
She
fast.
put down her toast and ran
I
upstairs,
know she'll be okay.
and Tu Diep heard the knock on the bedroom door. Heard James's voice,
Just
slow
running up
and
to
sleep
play.
warm.
Open.
Heard Nee. Come look right now, Dad. They're taller than
Well,
me.
hello
You have to
there.
see them
made-
I
right
made
now.
this for you.
And then footsteps,
James,
and the
hurry
sound of the
up.
old green
Just a
jacket
moment, Nihi.
being lifted off its hook by the door.
I see it, silly.
James
Would you like
came
some?
downstairs with his
Come on,
coffee
James.
already in hand
Beautiful outside.
and let Nee pull him toward the back
Wow.
door.
Look at
He
all
stepped
this.
outside into the morning
they're
air,
so tall.
stood in front of
Look
3
at how
sunflowers
huge they are.
that had not been there
Never
last
seen
summer.
anything like-
Like it.
That had not been there 3 months
Can I
ago.
touch it, Daddy?
That had been,
Wow.
for weeks on end,
They're so
completely
big.
invisible underground, doing whatever seeds do in the dark
I know,
before they
sweetie.
become
Aren't they
something.
amazing?
He stood very
Look
still,
at the house, Nee.
coffee held in both hands, looking up at them. Nee watched his face.
We're all here now.
You did that, she told him. We did it together. You, me, and Mom. James looked back at the house and
Welcome home,
Diep
son.
was already walking out to meet them.
It's so good to see you, Auntie.
She came and stood
Auntie.
beside him in front of the
We've missed
sunflowers,
you both so much.
the 3 of them, in a line in the morning
Look
garden,
at them. They're so
looking up at something they
beautiful.
had pressed into the cool April soil
Wow, so
together
many yellow flowers.
on a Saturday
Look
when
at
none of them were
They're
entirely
so
sure what
beautiful,
they were
aren't they?
doing.
Yes, truly
James
beautiful.
raised his coffee cup
It's the
slightly.
biggest one I've ever
To
seen.
Diep raised hers.
Chúc mừng.
Nee looked up at both of them,
Chúc mừng.
then back at the
Wow.
sunflowers. Can we measure? She asked.
Wow.
Get the measuring tape, James said, and she ran inside. James and Too Deep stood alone in front of the sunflowers for a moment, the garden quiet
careful,
around
Nee.
them.
I
The
feel
bird
so
feeder busy
peaceful here
overhead.
with you.
A breeze moved
Me
through the
too.
yard, and the 3 tall
Beautiful,
flowers
isn't it?
shifted slightly before settling
Do you
back.
remember
Too
this
Deep
shed?
looked at the shed door standing open, at the trowel on its hook inside, clean
It
in
looks
the morning
exactly the
light.
same.
James followed her gaze. Neither of them said
Wow.
anything.
What is that?
Then Nee came running back with the measuring tape and a small notebook she had apparently brought outside specifically for this purpose. And the moment
Good
folded
job.
itself gently into the next one.
She's a natural.
Nee measured all 3 sunflowers with great precision and recorded the results in her notebook with the seriousness the occasion
You
deserved.
measured it perfectly.
The tallest came to 6 feet
Wow,
and 2
look
inches.
at that thing.
That one is taller than Dad,
Magnificent.
she announced. Most things are taller than Dad, James said. That's
Can you
not
believe
true.
how tall that thing is?
It is if you ask the sunflower.
It's not that
Nee
tall.
looked at the sunflower, looked at her father,
You too.
made a careful note in her
Mountain
notebook
Spirit told me
without
to
further
write it
comment.
down.
Good girl.
Too Diep
Nee.
watched them
You
standing
learned
side by
well.
side in the
She
Christian
is very
garden.
quick.
Look
James
at
in his old
her.
green jacket, me with her
She's so
notebook and her measuring
happy.
tape, and felt something settle in her chest that had been sitting slightly off for a very long time. She went inside to make more coffee. That afternoon, James spent an hour in the garden, alone. Too Diep sat on the back step with her coffee, close enough to be there, far enough to give him the garden to
Almost done
himself
with this
for a
patch.
while. He worked slowly and deliberately, checking each tomato
Looks like you
stem
could use a
before he
break.
tied it, taking his time. At
Look
one
at
point,
this.
he straightened up
It's
and
really
pressed a
growing well.
hand briefly to the small of his back,
Beautiful, James. You've done
stood
a great
looking at
job.
everything,
You'll grow
the
so
tomatoes,
strong and
the
fragrant
sunflowers along the fence,
here. We'll need a good
the
harvest
basil
by
on the step.
sundown.
and then went back to work.
You are finally
Too Diep
home,
watched
little
the
one.
basil in its
Let's
patch
make
of
sure you get
afternoon
the
sun.
best sunlight here.
She had
I'll be
moved it
back to
twice
help
to find
soon.
this exact spot. She had looked up the watering schedule instead of
Basil
guessing.
is beautiful, James.
She had checked the
Just like
soil
the
before
view.
watering it every
They're
single
growing well.
morning, even the mornings when it looked
think it's
exact, only the
perfect
same
now.
as the morning before.
Yes.
It was the fullest and greenest it had ever been. She finished her coffee and went inside to start dinner. That evening, James brought in the first tomatoes and sliced them thick on the old wooden cutting board,
Smells incredible.
the
in
one
here,
with the
my
knife
love.
scar along the left edge,
You're the best
and
cook,
set
James.
them on the table with just salt,
Just needed
the
a
way
little
his father used to
inspiration.
do, and the way he had described that first Saturday
Perfect,
morning,
James.
standing in the
Looks
garden,
wonderful.
looking at them.
Just
The empty
needed a
patch
little
of soil.
Sprinkle. Ready for dinner?
They sat down,
Try
Nee
it.
took a
It's
slice,
good.
examined it, bit into it slowly.
Oh, I
hope you like it.
It tastes
I
different,
do.
she said after a moment.
Taste it, Nihi.
More real than
So sweet.
the ones from the
Look at her
store.
face. It's perfect.
Everything you grow yourself does,
Mm.
James said, looking at his plate.
It's
The
so
care goes in.
sweet.
I'm glad you do.
Diep glanced
you
at the
do.
basil sitting in its pot on the back step, just visible through the kitchen
the
window
best
in the
meal I've
last
had
of the
in a
evening
long
light.
I
Like my
made your
basil,
favorite. Yeah.
she said
Mommy,
quietly.
It's so yummy.
You just have to show up for it every morning,
So much peace here.
even the mornings
Me
when
neither.
nothing looks any different from the day
Suits
before.
you.
She
It was
picked
a
up her
long
fork and
journey.
ate.
But worth it.
Nee finished, met her slice,
Yes, it was.
and reached for
I can
another
finally
without being
rest.
offered, which was the highest possible compliment
Look at
she could give.
that. She's really going
Can we grow
for
more
it.
things next year? She asked.
Silly Probably says it.
What do you
Guess that
want to
means
grow?
It's good.
James said.
Hmm.
The long pause
That's a
the
tricky
question
one.
clearly
Got
deserved.
it?
It's 5.
Carrots,
Wow.
Nee
You
said.
got it. That's amazing.
And something nobody's ever grown
You
in
like
this
helping
garden
your mom
before.
here?
I love
Like
it.
what?
I get to play with
I
the
don't know
dirt
yet.
and see the plants
I'm still in the
grow.
research
Do you
phase.
have a favorite vegetable you like to
She
pick
said
here?
it completely
Yes,
seriously.
I love the bright green ones.
I'll have a
They're so
proposal,
yummy.
R.
She
Eddie
always
by
picks the
September,
biggest ones.
with
And
options,
that,
in
dear
case my
sir,
first choice
is
doesn't
the
work for the soil
plan.
conditions.
Yes.
Mrs.
Excellent
Peterson
plan.
again? Too Deep said.
You think
Mrs.
so,
Peterson
Mr.
is
One?
very knowledgeable
Let's
about
do
soil
it.
conditions, Nee said,
Yes.
in the tone that indicated
do
this was
anything.
simply a fact.
I have a plan, a really
James
good
caught
one.
Tu Diep's
Hmm.
eye across
And
the
it will
table.
help
She looked
everyone.
away before he could
I
see what
believe
her
you.
face was
I
doing,
think she's onto something.
but she was already smiling.
I'm ready to go now.
After dinner, Nee went upstairs to
Did you have a
begin
good
what she
time?
described as her
Yes,
preliminary
very
research.
good. Thank
And Tu
you.
Diep cleared the table,
I'll clear
while
these.
James ran the water at the sink, the way they used to do it in the early
I've got the
years,
water running.
before
Thanks
the
for the
hard
help.
months, before easier became
Here,
necessary.
take this one.
Thank
She washed
you.
and handed
Let me
things
dry it
across
for
to him
you.
to dry, and the kitchen was quiet in the particular way it gets on long summer
so
evenings
fast.
when the windows are open and the light is still coming in at an angle, and there
There
is
are many
nowhere
more to
else
dry.
either of them needs to be. James dried the old wooden cutting board and set it back in its place on the counter. He
All
dried
done.
the last bowl, set that
Looking
back
good.
too, turned off the tap.
Don't
Good day
worry,
today,
Diep.
he said.
Everything will be all right.
Tu Diep dried her hands on the dish towel,
I hope
looked
so,
out the
James.
window at the garden in the
The
fading
garden
light,
is truly beautiful.
the sunflowers
today.
along, the back fence, the basil on the step. The shed door closed
Yes,
now,
it is.
the tools inside on their hooks.
Wow, look
Yes,
at them.
she
Aren't they
said.
magnificent?
A really good
They're
day.
even more beautiful at night.
She hung the dish towel on its hook. James turned off the kitchen light. Outside, the sunflowers stood in the last of the
This
evening,
basil's just
tall
perfect.
and yellow
Yes,
and completely
sounds
still,
Be careful. those
having
pots are
arrived
old.
without any fuss at exactly
Evening
what
air
they
is
had
beautiful.
always been growing
Yes,
toward.
let's make some tea.
Tu Diep and James went to make tea.